There we go.
There we go. Just wanted to be sure that we were on a rolling tape when and we have to redo that whole introduction, by the way, now, right? No, I'm just kidding. We're good. But thank you, everybody. And it's a pleasure to see all of you here today. And thanks for taking a moment out of your busy days to join us today. And, as Tanya mentioned, my bio is available in the registration for this. But what it doesn't tell you is who I am and what my story is. And we talked a little bit ago about the importance of stories, and this will help inform our dialogue today as well when we show up as leaders. But my progress and my path to the work that I'm doing today was really informed by the moment I arrived in life and kind of how I was raised. I am the child of immigrant parents who met in Chicago on the north side. My mother's from Puerto Rico and my father's from Ecuador, and they met in the workplace, and it was a big scandal, but it ended happily because I'm here. So it was all good. But I grew up on the north side of Chicago as having Spanish as my first language, going through school experiences that reinforced messages of not belonging and struggling to learn the language and to adapt to the communities that I was a part of. My father was a factory worker who moved quite often between factories due to either job layoffs or other circumstances. And we moved around so much that I was in 6 different schools by the time I reached 4th grade. And so the idea of belonging and not connecting and readjusting to new circumstances definitely informed my life experience. And it allowed me to connect, I feel, and naturally connect to individuals and communities that also experience the realities of not belonging or of exclusion. And it led me to this work. And so I've been doing this work for over 20 years. I spent 25 years in total in higher education and served in various capacities in leadership roles, particularly in the DEI space. And what I'm hoping to talk a little bit about today, and it's really just to have a dialogue. I'm going to just share some really thoughts on how DEI and how leadership shows up on our campuses, and really challenge us to think more about the bigger impact and legacy we're going to leave through our work, intentionally, and really consider the weight of responsibility that we carry in our roles for how we impact one another as colleagues and how we impact our students that we serve. And in order to do that, we really have to have a willingness to challenge norms and to really understand, the opportunity that's in front of us. And so having spent 25 years in student affairs at various institutions, I noticed a trend quite often. You had a lot of work that was rooted in and foundational in many ways and tied to traditional academic work around student development, traditional work that had been happening for decades around student development that was almost entirely done by white men. And it really helped shape and inform kind of how we did things and what was normed and what wasn't normed, or what was considered outside the traditional status quo. And so one thought I had as we get into this conversation today is to really understand that in order to really reach students more fully and understand the capacity we have to really help shape and lay a foundation for their development, it requires us to really understand the evolving and diverse needs of our students that go well beyond what the theoretical models might have been, 3 decades ago, which I think back then also missed huge opportunities, right? And so I often think about some of the things I've heard in higher ed when I was in higher ed. I left higher ed last summer to pursue the consulting work I'm doing now. But in my time there, I often heard, ideas of what good leadership looked like, the phrase good leadership. I also, heard quite often the idea of what student would be a good fit for this leadership role. And the same kind of phraseology being used in interviews when we brought in new colleagues as well. And I thought about the traditions that existed at the schools that I worked at and what other schools I've seen as models around the country. What were their traditions and where were those traditions rooted? And how were they forged and formed? And who was allowed to participate in those traditions when those were formed and who wasn't? And how did that potentially shape the story of who belongs in those traditions and who doesn't? So when we see the traditions of homecoming or other traditions that exist on college campuses, who most often gets involved? Who do we usually turn to lead these programs? Who is the makeup of the the boards or the task force or the committees that are putting together the traditions and the programs that really shape the narrative of our institutions. You know, it makes me think also about how we role model those types of functions and those realities. You know, how do we role model thinking about who's not present in the conversation, who's invisible on our campus or in this dialogue that we're not really hearing from or aware of, right? And so there's so much in our traditions and rootedness in higher education that is rooted in concepts and ideas of whiteness and white supremacy that it absolutely has to be acknowledged and understood in order to create models and forward movement and progress and work that doesn't replicate the ills of the past, but also doesn't reinforce ideas of who should participate and who belongs and who doesn't belong, right? So important questions that we have to ask. I often saw in higher education as well examples of, you know, visibility and representation in our campus leadership organizations or in representatives of the college or university. So when you look at, you know, student ambassadors, those student groups that welcome visitors to the campus, they help give college tours. They really help represent the school at different functions and events. Who made up those ambassador groups? What was their makeup in terms of racial, ethnic makeup, language ability, and so on and so forth? What did that communicate to guests and visitors who were touring the school and visiting the school? I know in my experience, you know, looking at how student ambassadors were led and formed might have created situations where we were missing opportunities to reach families and individuals from underrepresented groups. I've had more than once in my life experience in higher education, more than a handful of times, parents of color, Black women, Black men, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Asian, and so forth, come to me after the official tour and come to my DEI office and ask me. They would say, you know, I got the official tour, but now can you give me the real information, right? Can you give me the real story of how my student will experience this campus? And so those are all examples of ways that we norm things on college campuses, and we may not consider the impact it's having on those voices that have been traditionally left out. So things to consider in terms of our leadership. So I want to move on to also talk about the way leadership opportunities and programs also play out in my experience and what some of the research I've seen. And so we have examples of student leadership that asks the question, you know, who should we reach out to? Who do we invite to be a part of a student leadership process, or maybe take an active and visible role in student government? And in my experience, that typically happens just by word of mouth. Colleagues talking to one another saying, I have this really great student that I think should get involved and really take time to really contribute, and I think they'd be great. And we often fall back to whatever's comfortable for us as colleagues and as professionals. And we often don't consider reaching out and giving opportunities to students of color, for example. And I've seen an example also of the deficit thinking that seems to happen when it comes to students of color, that reaching out to a student of color for a leadership role or position, you know, may not be in their best interest. They might have too much on their plate. They might have not the ability to handle all this stuff. Kind of the unconscious ways that we reinforce deficit thinking to limit opportunities for students of color and other underrepresented groups as well. I know when I served as advisor and headed up our Men of Color initiatives on the various campuses that I was at, the students that responded most, for example, there was an image here of our My Brother's Keeper group from Carthage College during my time there. And, you know, what really resonated with getting men involved in this program and getting students of color involved in leadership programs as a whole was the elimination of deficit thinking, the elimination of deficit mindsets, the real opportunity to communicate to students who are probably accustomed to hearing a lot of deficit thinking, to really offer opportunities to be involved in leadership excellence programs that allow us to grow as human beings, fully as human beings, as any other student would be able to in any role on campus, and not to diminish the role of a My Brother's Keeper or other organizations like this, to see ourselves as vital cogs in the wheel of the campus life and who we are. And so students, I feel, regardless of what groups we advise, want to and are hungry for want to engage in important conversations about how I can become a better human being and a better leader in this role that I serve in as a college student. What are my hopes and aspirations? What do I, care for? And really, taking care of and understanding the cultural capital that each individual carries with them, and what potential there is for us to feed that and build on that capital to really help folks see themselves in a world where they may be thinking, I don't belong, that to reshape that into, I know what I'm capable of because I've been a part of programs and a support system and a connected network of professional staff that care about me as a student. They see the potential in me and they are absolutely invested in seeing that grow. So challenging norms, right? Really understanding that the way we do things, it has its own set foundational value. But if we're not asking ourselves regularly, how can I revisit the way we do things? Who am I missing in the opportunity to grow in these areas? What is the way we're doing things communicating to students about their ability to participate or not participate, or to see themselves successful or not successful in these programs? I think those are things that we have to do consistently, annually, and revisit the needs of our students so that we can make sure that the way we are doing things doesn't fall prey to just becoming routine and missing those opportunities.
So Roger, can I pause for a second? Because I'd
Please.
love for you to say a little, because I'm following everything you're saying. I'd love for you to say a little bit more about how deficit thinking sounds in the mouths of leadership educators. Because I think that that's a massive, we don't hear ourselves because it's so much a part of our socialization.
Yes.
How might deficit thinking sound?
Yeah, there are so many ways I want to answer that. The first thought that came to my mind is like, we all just heard that, right? Right. It's one of those things that we pick up immediately when we feel an effort or a communication or the outreach or invitation to be a part of something is performative or is genuine, right? And this slide might speak a little bit to it in terms of, me walking up to a student, the same student of color that I asked to do everything, and ask them, we'd love for you to be involved in this. It's a good opportunity for you. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, you come to me for everything, right? And my plate is full. And I love the opportunity, but there are other folks that can have opportunities as well. So there's a variety of different ways that shows up. But I think the way we communicate and the way we address deficit thinking is to be honest about our own deficit thinking and our own deficit biases that we carry, and to really scrutinize research in higher education, that really might reinforce that deficit thinking as well, to understand where that might be coming from as well. And so I think that could be its own workshop at some point down the road as well.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you naming deficit thinking is based in bias.
Yeah.
And we don't often hear it because it's a bias. And so it is one of those things are we thinking that people have deficits at all? Mm-hmm. I think that's super powerful. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and it's rooted. I mean, I think another whole session we can do, but it's rooted in who we've been, right? The story of this country, for example, right? And the narratives that were told of non-white folks for centuries that reinforce deficit thinking and deficit mindset within entire communities and how we've been socialized. And so it's all connected with that. Any other questions or thoughts anyone wanted to share before we move ahead?
I don't see anything in the chat just yet. And that is a great invitation. If folks have questions, I can work on getting them in. But
absolutely.
I don't see anything in the chat just yet.
Absolutely. Well, moving ahead, and just another area that I think that we should consider as leaders, in higher education and the impact that we have, right, is how do we role model, authentically validating and offering, concepts, ideas, and living out, the hope that we have for each individual to really maximize their potential and to be supported in the process versus toxic positivity. And how many of you, just as a quick, okay, we weren't going to have any polls, but let's just do a quick little hand raise poll if you could use your emoji. option. How many of you have seen examples or see examples of toxic positivity pretty much daily in your campus experience, whether it be from colleagues, yourself perhaps, or from students? Just a show of hands, I'm curious. Yeah. It's quite prevalent. And, and I think especially, during this time that we've had the last 2 years now of dealing with a global pandemic and, the summer of 2020 and what that, entailed and really informed us about racial justice in America. There's so much that we are, dealing with that has proven in many ways to be very, very difficult challenges for white folks, let's call it for what it is, in engaging in these matters with endurance and with stamina when it comes to these issues. And I think in the summer of 2020, you saw a lot of folks kind of have an awakening in many ways. We saw the largest social justice movement protests that I think we'd seen in pretty much in our country's history. And that seems to have faded, right? Predominantly with those folks who this was new territory for them. And then it kind of faded away as it became more and more uncomfortable or an afterthought, which is a sign of your privilege, right? To be able to disengage. But often you would hear from folks that, I can't engage anymore because I want to be, I just want to not be so negative, right? Let's just have positive conversations. Let's just, we're going to get there. The country will get there. It's going to be okay, right? And all well-meaning thoughts that could have devastating consequences for the receiver of the message if I'm from a marginalized or oppressed community. And I saw this a lot on college campuses where, for students who courageously and vocally would call out and really try to address issues of inequity and homophobia and transphobia on college campuses being labeled as just being a bit too much or just being, troublemakers and just, I've had enough of these students, right? And kind of who they are. I once had a colleague who had a little vase in their office that said ashes of problem students, right? And it was supposed to be this tongue-in-cheek joke. And I remember being kind of repulsed by that, thinking, that's kind of what you think about your students, right? And so we tend to label students who could be problematic as students develop, right? And it's I think the irony of irony is that the field itself is called student development, right? So we have to grapple with the reality that students deal with very, very difficult circumstances, and having conversations and feedback to students that just tells them, hang in there, you'll be okay, or you are being put into this position to succeed and you cannot fail. This cannot be an option. You have to do everything you can to be successful, and on and on and on, can really have destructive consequences for our students. And they notice that, right? They notice that when we do it ourselves and when we do that with colleagues. If you're ever in circumstances or situations where you have multiple colleagues in a room working with student organizations and student groups, this will play out and your students probably won't tell you, but they notice that, and they'll either be horrified by it or they'll replicate it. And more often than not, it's the latter. When we talk about toxic positivity, when we talk about why diverse groups are not sitting together in the cafeteria, when we're talking about who attends programs, what types of programs people attend, and people bemoan the fact that students aren't turning out more to these types of events or sitting together in the cafeteria, they often don't notice that we're doing it ourselves, right? And so we have to role model the leadership that we aspire to, and we hope to have our students aspire to. So be mindful of that as you move forward in terms of how we communicate with one another. How to avoid toxic positivity, to me, means be invested, be willing to listen, be actively engaged in the dialogue and in the person or persons that are in front of you sharing their stories, so that you are able to respond in a way that lifts up, doesn't seem dismissive, right? Because when you say things that are Pollyannish or what have you, the intent is well-meaning, but the impact could be very, very, very challenging and difficult for folks to hear. And it could close doors for you to reach that student in future work. So thoughts on that at all?
I think so this what you have, validation and hope versus toxic positivity, is so powerful. The validation and hope that feels different. And I imagine students would say that it feels different as well. I think that also we have to, as leadership educators, have to check in with our own ability to hold hope and validation. Where do we get our validation from? And so, yeah, I love that. I think we exist sometimes at that surface toxic positivity because we're not actually allowing for that work for ourselves.
Yeah, and they notice, right? They being students will notice, and it's incredibly important that we pay attention to that moving forward. And the validation piece is something that I think is the key to it, right? You are validating, you're hearing me, you're seeing me, right? You're understanding, and it also might mean that part of authentic, validating, and hopeful communication is telling students, I don't know what you're going through, and I don't know how to support you and help you. I can't relate to that experience. Let's work together to find out ways that you can find that support, because I want to be able to learn that too. We do it all the time, and it's in every profession, not just student affairs, right? We are unable or unwilling to acknowledge the limitations of our knowledge or our experience, to not appear that we don't know what we're doing in front of students. And it's okay to let students know, I don't know what I'm doing here, right? It's a hole I have in my learning and my experience, and I want to try to support you as well. And I think that's a great way to role model how you handle fear and doubt as well, right? So to really understand that we are full and complete human beings, and that we maybe are unsure about doing things, but also understanding that that has an impact as well. And I want to kind of transition a little bit to talk a little bit about how, as leaders, and in particular, the leadership at the highest level of your institutions and organizations, this is a huge piece right here with the fear versus opportunity, because quite often in addressing the very real challenges that students have on our campuses, we fear the visible perception that might create in board members, in potential students, potential donors, and we will then not act in ways that leadership often requires of us because of those fears. And I'm giving examples in a variety of different ways that show up on campuses all across the country. But we hear from the research, whether it's from Dr. Sean Harper or others that are deeply engaged in research in higher education, to anecdotal experiences that I and others have had, where you have, for example, campus incidents that occur. You might have racist graffiti show up on the door of a student in their residence hall. You might have transphobic and homophobic shouting happening to a student as they cross the street on campus. And you might have repeated hate crimes that occur on campus, and each time not getting a response from the administration, right? Not getting a response from campus leaders. And those are opportunities for not just the leader of an institution, but all of us within our own departments to vocalize our intolerance of hate and our absolute commitment to creating equity and inclusion for all students. And so we need to step up our leadership, because we often on college campuses wait for BSU, Black Student Union, to respond, or another group to respond first, and let students take the lead. We've also seen this when it came to diversity trainings. I've had campus leaders say to me over my 25-year career that we really should look to Black Student Union. That would be great if they would help lead training on our campus when it comes to racial equity, rather than create a department, create an intercultural center, create a position, and so on and so forth, to really decide to put the load and weight of education on the backs of students who are already marginalized, already oppressed in many ways, who are dealing with major issues on the campus as they've shared, and then being expected to educate the campus community as well. It's a really, really, in my opinion, an irresponsible ask of folks. If student organizations want to be engaged in a process and be co-trainers and peer trainers, and it's the choice of student organizations and individuals to do that, by all means, that should be an opportunity that's offered. But to rely on students to create the types of outcomes that we want is a diffusion of responsibility that professionals engage in, campus leaders engage in, and is the opposite of what we mean by anti-racism and inclusion on college campuses. And so we have to own the fears that we might have of who might be upset that we're doing campus diversity training, who might be upset among the faculty when they say that the institution is now requiring professional development on DEI for all professionals, who might be upset among the board when, the decision is made to institutionalize DEI work. As one board member once told me years ago, I'm taking the consideration of DEI that you're proposing seriously, but I'm just letting you know that people don't like to be told how to think and what to think. And I don't appreciate you thinking that you should tell folks what to think. And kind of making it clear where they stood on that and what some of the challenges might be. It's the importance of college leaders being visible and not performative and proactive when hate crimes occur, of not falling into an ideology that kind of states that my saying something will only exasperate it. Or as some college leaders have said to me in the past, that if I make a statement every time there's an incident on campus, then no one will listen to me. So therefore I'll do nothing, right? Therefore I will do nothing. And so it's really understanding the responsibility we carry to speak out for the values of who we are as leaders and who we are as an institution. Any thoughts on any of that? Comments?
I want to make sure that I open it up. Roger, you and I can have a conversation all day about this. I have lots of thoughts, but I want to make sure that I open it up to folks. Are people seeing, some of what in the last 3 points that Roger has made, are people seeing examples of this on campus? I know when I was on campus, I was in higher education for about 25-ish years before moving into work with LeaderShape and doing consulting. And I absolutely, just what you said around groups of students having the responsibility to, or being asked to, if not facilitate, to be the educators. And one of the things that I always tell students is your job is to go to school. That is your primary job as an enrolled student at this institution. And I think that, just what you're saying, I think that as leadership educators, we get to, we can obviously work with students and we want to have student voice, but the level of responsibility should never land with students. And so what do we have to look at for ourselves? And that's what I hear, fear versus opportunity. Do we see the opportunity for campus transformation when we take on the roles that you're talking about?
Yeah, really well said. And I would say that, we talked earlier about how our stories and our histories shape our present reality. And so when I think about the way we do things, and the reliance on students, for example, to carry loads, very much in my mind, tied in exploitive practices, right? That go back decades in the expectations we had of campus officials or campus representatives and the roles that we ask our students to take part in. We see the same type of exploitation, I would say, at least the word should be entered into the conversation about the reality of student development professionals as well, and the realities that we encounter with long hours and weekends. And, I've had colleagues for years in residence life where I've had conversations with them about their well-being and being taken care of. And, the issues that existed for professionals in that area of higher ed were already challenging before the pandemic. And then when the pandemic hit, it just exasperated it even more, right? So understanding what are the expectations, what am I being asked to do? What's realistic? Can we set up a culture as leaders where I'm able to communicate with a supervisor, for example, and they're asking me to add another full-time job on top of my other 2 full-time jobs, to really say, instead of just saying, okay, and in fearing that I have to accept this, to maybe be able to say, I understand that this is a new priority that you're asking me to do, and I agree it has absolute priority. What can I take off my plate that I've been working on before to allow me to do this to the best of my ability? What do you think how can we prioritize the entirety of what I'm being asked to do so that we can take care of the highest priorities first and perhaps put others on the back burner until such time when there's the bandwidth to be able to handle it, right? That kind of culture is something that I think we should expect, but it's counter to what is typically seen, number one. And number two, as much as organizational leadership speakers and researchers kind of suggest that those are best practices that are available to us, it's been my experience that more often than not, when you do ask for those types of communication, it's seen as you're not carrying enough weight, right? You're not doing your part. You're not a good team player, right? The things that we communicate that reinforce the things we've talked about so far, right? Toxic positivity and fear and opportunity. So lots to think about, right? In terms of how we show up shaping our realities and the impact of our work and the efficiency and energy to be able to do our work. And so if that's not a possibility for you to ask for those types of realities, how do we at least try to role model that with our students so that they could see that it's possible? Maybe the way we run student organizations, maybe we do what some student governments that I've advised or been an advisor for, that they could take a 1 hour meeting once a week, and any agenda items that they don't reach, they table to the next meeting, versus other examples I've seen of student government associations that meet at 9 or 9:30 p.m. on a weeknight, expect their professional advisors to be there, and don't end the meeting until the agenda is complete at perhaps 12:30 or 1 in the morning, right? So, expecting and understanding that while we have all of these things we want to offer as opportunities for students, how do we role model and understand how we show up and how it impacts one another? Because we are not just students. We are not just whatever job title I carry in the institution that I'm at. We are full and complete human beings. And many of us have connections to our community and the other organizations that make up who we are, our churches, our community organizations, our social network, close friends and family. And so how we show up and role model balance in our living as well communicates often to our students what our values are. And I think there's value in carrying ourselves and conducting ourselves as professionals in ways that really reinforce the idea of being a multifaceted human being who has an impact and circles of influence in many areas outside of just where you see me at the campus, right? This is especially true for folks who are in partnered relationships, the individuals who might have pets or other loved, communities that they want to take care of in the animal world, whether it be animal welfare or what have you, folks who have partnered relationships or children. So there's lots of ways that we show up as human beings, and all of them are valid, right? And if we only show an example of overextending ourselves and disregarding those other priorities in our lives, we might not be role modeling the best leadership for our students.
So
Comments?
I want to bring in something that Lindsay says, because it's a good point. I think it's connected to the fear opportunity piece of budget concerns are real in higher education. I think particularly now, and you're not being a budget downer, Lindsay. There's fear for staff. I love what you're saying, and I think it's absolutely true. And how do we as staff deal with the balance of the fear of causing the staff that causes issue, or that's the problem when cuts come, will that be something that people consider? It's like, okay, well, this person's causing a problem. Should they be out the door? So how do we balance that with the honesty that you're talking about? Because I think it's real, with the reality of budget.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lindsay, thanks for asking that. And I think you bring in here a really important point, though, as well, in terms of the potential answer to that, right? Which is alliances and coalitions, which, people of color have been doing in higher education for decades, right? To try to survive the realities that are faced there as professionals, as teachers, as staff members, and so forth. And so I think that's where it lies, right? I think that the ability to demonstrate, and that's been part of my experience as well as being in coalitions with Black and Brown faculty and staff at the institutions I've been at, to really work through in a safe space the issues that are impacting us, and to give each other advice, support, and whatever we need to really, not just survive, but to thrive, ultimately thrive. And similarly, students hear about these things, right? Because we work closely with our students. and the willingness to engage in coalitions among students as well, based on students of marginalized identities and some of the shared experiences that are being had, is powerful and impactful, and it can help shape change on your college campuses. I've seen it work on college campuses where coalitions of students have been able to bring to light and bring to the attention of the administration and board very, very important issues that have been ignored for decades. One example was at my last institution, where we had a coalition of students gathered together with my office to really push forward and really instigate and spearhead a change in the team mascot of the college that we were at. Over about a 3-year process, we were able to achieve that, and it was a win for our community, for everyone in our community. But it was spearheaded by voices who were invisible to most, and found strength and energy and momentum in coalitions. Maria said something here. I agree that modeling to our students the balance of roles in our lives is important to their student development and healthy integration of their own multiple roles. Yeah, I mean, these folks are going to be, impactful influencers in the communities that they end up graduating from college and going into, right? And so I think when we role model it, it doesn't just role model balance, which is incredibly important. It also role models, the opposite of deficit thinking, right? That you are capable of being a multifaceted human being and having an influence in a multitude of areas, not just one, right? And so to understand that I have an opportunity to be, and I know that one of the best moments I had with my Brother's Keeper group, our Men of Color group on my campus, was when we did a timeline activity on past, present, and future, and talking a little bit about the successes of our past, the challenges of our present, and who we hope to be in the future, and really using that to do really, really important dialogue to see our students see themselves as, and these were all traditional students in the 18 to 22 range. And so seeing yourself potentially as a parent one day, seeing yourself as a school board leader one day, seeing yourself as a CEO one day, seeing yourself at age 50 one day, right? And understanding the realities of, when I reach age 50, what do I hope to have accomplished by then, right? And the variety of answers and responses that came from that. So role modeling it is super, super important. Great point. Other comments or thoughts before we move ahead?
I am noticing time. Just want to make sure that you're able to get all of the goodness that you have available.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll just briefly touch upon this, because I think I've been focusing on this slide unintentionally, but very importantly early on, and that is the importance of social justice and contributing to a world that creates more equity for everyone. And so the way we role model that is to show up authentically for social justice. It's understanding that we all have something to learn. It's taking the time to engage in professional development opportunities and personal development opportunities to learn, to read, to engage in, and to understand more fully social justice issues, equity and inclusion issues, and how they show up in our society and on our campuses, which often mirror those of society. It's understanding that students will recognize performative actions and steps pretty immediately, and that causes not only the intended outcome, I think, of performative allyship is for folks to be convinced that you're all in and to try to gain support or to gain allyship. But the real effect is to negatively impact groups and damage that potential relationship in the future, right? Or having to take a lot of time and energy to repair relationships that have been harmed by performative allyship. And so we have to understand that performative allyship is only a reinforcement of the inequitable structures that are already in place anyway. So you're not doing anything to support, right? So I think that there's something to be said about how we show up for that, right? So how do we do that as professionals? Well, there are a variety of different ways. If I am a person that advises student leadership groups on the campus that I work at, who am I reaching out to recruit for these leadership opportunities? Who am I recruiting to serve on my orientation leader team? And what's the makeup of my orientation leader team each year before orientation begins? And who's there and who missed out, right? Who are our student ambassadors? Who are our student government representatives? And on and on. In Greek life, what Greek organizations are available on my campus that have been there traditionally, but others have been left out? Are we taking into consideration the diverse array of Greek life organizations that have been available and historically been around for over a century to provide an opportunity for our students to engage in? So lots of things to consider in terms of how we stand up for social justice. Do we speak out? Do we talk more fully and completely about who we are as an institution, where we're failing, and what we need to work on to get better? Are we speaking out when incidents occur on campus? Are we reaching out and creating spaces for students to connect and dialogue and engage with one another and work through the difficult trauma that might happen when an incident occurs, not just on campus, but in our society, the traumatic effect that could have on students and the communities within your organization? But we have to consider also that this could also, if we're relying on the one student or the one student group or the one or two colleagues to lead all these efforts, we also have to consider the possibility that social justice advocacy and engagement is a lot of work, requires a lot of energy and the fullness of who we are as human beings in our mind, body, and soul to pour into if we're really doing it. And that's exhausting. And that can lead to burnout for many individuals. So when individuals are being asked to carry the load for social justice on your campus as colleagues, are we asking, what can I do to help? How can I get involved? What can I do to shoulder more of the load? What can I do to not rely on the DEI office to do all the programming on campus, but others could take the initiative to do their own programming as well? And I know that created, when we were doing that at the institution, last institution I was at, there was a trickle-out effect, a ripple effect of the, seeing other groups jump in that were traditionally not involved into more of the DEI learning. Greek organizations suddenly reaching out saying, what can we do to address homophobia and transphobia and anti-racism in our organizations, right? What can we do to teach our organization more about this? And then suddenly the men's volleyball team asks that if they can do anti-racism training, student athletes deciding that this was important for them to grow as individuals and as human beings moving forward. So we have to be fully invested in this. And social justice work is not a series of quarterly reports or action steps or strategic plans that are just put together. They are how we live. DEI work is how we live and how we show up for one another every day and how we recognize institutional barriers and how we stand up to them and ask ourselves to be better in that regard. So just a few questions I'd like us to consider moving forward as you move past this call and just move into your own, back into your roles and into your own movement forward. How do students, and to really have us consider our role in this, right? How we role model this. We often ask, how do students handle emotions, stress, failure? It's a big part of our work, but do we ask enough, how do we handle these emotions and how they're being recognized or noticed by colleagues or by students? How well do students take care of their health and well-being? How well do we take care of our health and well-being, right? I know for me in my career, and I can't speak for everyone, it was a real struggle to take care of health and well-being in terms of getting enough sleep, feeling tired all the time during stretches. And it's just exhausting, right? So how can we support one another in those moments where we do have to extend ourselves? We do have to surpass our temporary limitations to really support and do the work that's necessary. Is this a culture? Is higher ed a culture that glorifies burning the candle on both ends? And do we see, kind of the shaming that might happen if you're not doing that? How many of you say that you've seen a culture like that or been involved or have heard of cultures like that, right? Where if you're not burning the candle on both ends, you are just seen as not committed enough, right? Not responsible enough, and so on and so forth. And potentially reflected in your evaluations or in your potential for advancement or a number of factors, right? In terms of the culture that we create. How do sexism, misogyny, homophobia, toxic masculinity, racism, etc., how do they show up in higher ed and in the experiences of our students and in one another as colleagues? Important questions we have to ask, and also ask ourselves, do I engage in any of those? Maybe unconsciously, but do I engage? Because we can't create that transformation without engaging in our own work as well. And really to think much more broadly, this especially is my comment to our younger professionals that are listening in today. It's true for everyone, but I really feel like something that's not stressed enough in the younger experience in student development and in many fields is thinking of your legacy, the legacy that you have You might build a 30 to 40-year career in higher education and absolutely make a huge difference. And that's a good thing. And it also creates the possibility of complacency if we think we have a long career to advance and make a difference and miss the opportunity to make a difference every moment we have, regardless of what position we're in. Because so often we are going to be working with students just for that moment, right? It could be one interaction, it could be one semester together, 1 year together, but they will move on and a new generation will come in. And how we show up and grow and what we learn from mistakes or lessons that are to be learned from mistakes we've made are super important, right? To really serve better and to really create the kind of culture and opportunities and leadership that we hope that our students grow into. And I will say specifically that DEI is my lens. It's what I've done for years. And so much of this presentation has been about DEI because I think it's central and crucial and not talked about enough. Social justice is interwoven into everything that we do, and it's often overlooked and not thought of enough, and it's an afterthought in many of the actions that we take and in the steps that we take in working for students. So I would say that there should be, in my opinion, a willingness to engage through all of the challenges we have in higher ed through a social justice lens. And when you're ready to develop the capacity to vocally and visibly advocate for those, it's also the understanding that in doing so, there are potential responses and realities that exist in doing so. When you step into a position and an opportunity to be vocal and visible and potentially call out institutional practices that are inequitable, there will be possibility of responses from colleagues that are inspired by you, that want to help jump in and be a part of a coalition to address it, or those who will perceive you as a troublemaker. And to move to a place of equity and social justice and to really have students see your investment in them be full and complete and authentic, there are risks involved. And that's what I wanted to share today, is that there is leadership involves risks. Leadership involves discomfort. Leadership requires the humility to know that I have more to learn, no matter how long I've engaged in whatever field I've been in. And so regularly asking yourself, what can I learn? How am I? How committed am I? Am I being authentic in the work I'm engaging in? Am I developing the ability to say no when it's too much and I don't have enough bandwidth? Am I forming coalitions so that we get more buy-in and can further reach those who need to be reached? Those are a few of the many questions we can ask in terms of how we can grow in our fields and how we can grow in our work and have a lasting impact, so that no matter if you work with a student for a week or a month or 4 years, they will be forever impacted by the work that you've done with them and the interactions you had. So I'll pause there, and I'm mindful of the time. Ask if anybody else has any questions, comments, thoughts, perspectives.
Well, I guess really what we want to say is thank you. Thank you for having us think through a lot of important perspectives that leadership educators and just in general, higher education, all humans, really, and specifically to your point of social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion, like those are, it's a lens. And so we can see everything through what you have just offered. I'm noticing the time, and since we have a minute left, I want to make sure that we let you folks know about our other programs that are available. If you're not familiar with LeaderShape, we invite you to go to the website and check out our catalyst, resilience. And I was thinking about resilience actually when you were talking, Roger, about really being able to stay in this work
Right.
for a long time, and how resilience is connected to that. The Institute, and of course, Courageous Dialogue. You can learn more about the programs there, and we have a few folks who would love to engage the conversations with you. And if you share our vision of a just, caring, and thriving world and have the want and ability to make a donation, we are a nonprofit organization. And so if you want to give to that vision, connect with that vision, we have that available. Just want to say a big thank you for joining us. And I'm going to come off so we can actually just say bye to each other. Thank you again, Roger. Really, really appreciate giving us a lot to think about. And really appreciate everyone spending an hour with us today in this conversation. Feel free to reach out to the website or any of us if you have any questions, and we'll see you later. Take care.
Take care, all.